Hey guys, it's Liv here, and did you know that we were wrong about how Terastal worked? In today's video, I'm going to break down what Terastal actually does and why it might actually be a lot better on dual-type Pokemon than we initially thought. If you enjoy this type of content and you want to see more like it though, leave a like on the video and subscribe. We're just about at 2,000 subscribers, and if you want to say you were in the under 2K club before Scarlet and Violet hits, make sure to hit the subscribe button. While you're doing that, leave a like and comment down below what Terastal Pokemon you will be using in Scarlet and Violet. With that said though, let's get right into it. So initially, Terastal was thought to be just a way to change types, and obviously with changing types, you would be losing potential stabs. So it seemed like the way to compensate this was if you change into a type you didn't have, you just only have that stab. For example, if you took a Garchomp and you changed it into a fire type, it would only have fire stab. And the way to incentivize just changing into a type you had a stab for, it was by just giving you a boost to that additional stab. So for example, if I change a Garchomp into a ground type, yeah, I'm losing dragon, and I'm basically just cutting Garchomp's stabs in half while still keeping ground, but my ground attacks would do more. And this led a lot of people to believe that potentially the only real viable option was stab Terastals. Now, in today's video, I want to go over some options that I think could be really good for both ends of the spectrum, because it seems like even the mechanic for the damage calc is a little different than we thought. But basically, if you were to take the Terastal for another type, it's just the 1.5 boost. Simple, that's pretty easy to account for. But if you Terastal into your own type, you keep the stab either way for both the previous types, but you gain a 1.5 times boost after damage calculation, which is slightly different actually. I had someone point this out to me in my abilities tier list yesterday. Make sure to go check that out, by the way. But someone had pointed out it's not 1.5 boost afterwards. It's actually 1.33 times typically, and it gets to essentially 1.5 times more. I know it's a lot of math that I'm throwing at you guys, and I'm very sorry for that, but it is an important distinction to make actually, because basically it's instead of adding it so it's a 2 times boost, you're now just flat out getting a 2.25 times boost, which is slightly different. It matters a lot more at higher levels of competitive. For example, the difference with this would be if we, let's say, were to take Garchomp actually, and we're taking like an Outrage Garchomp just versus a Abomasnow because the first thing comes up on damage calc. If we were to give this thing adaptability, it would be hitting about 103% guaranteed versus a no HP, no Fizz Def Abomasnow. It's 103 to 122. With Terastal though, this ends up actually going to, oh, oops, wrong slide. I'm so sorry about that, guys. So this ends up actually bringing up Garchomp's damage roll from the non-adaptability boosted. Keep in mind, this number was 103 to 122. Instead, your damage roll is actually going to be 1.5 times off of the 77 to 91 initially, which brings your damage calc all the way to it's 116 minimum, so it's another 13% you're doing, which is pretty good. And that's again on a really low end of the calc. If we were to go up to the 91.5 calc and see the max range, this max range is now 137.25, which is a decent difference considering again your max range, if we were going off adaptability, was a whole 15% lower. This might mostly matter against neutral Pokemon, truthfully, especially when accounting for walls. Like a better example of this, for example, would be Fizz Def Hippowdon. So if we were to take Fizz Def Hippowdon, typically in OU, if you were to, let's say, run a max Fizz Def Hippowdon versus this Garchomp, if we were going off the adaptability calcs, that is, it's going to peak at 47% from a leftovers Garchomp. If you were to throw a Life Orb onto this, you actually can get almost guarantee the KO, albeit Hippo can still obviously go for stuff like Protect or Slack Off to get around this potentially, and just try and make you take Life Orb damage. However, if we were to take adaptability out of the question, one, you still have your contact move, your contact ability with Rough Skin, which is great, but two, your mineral goes up from around 52% to a whopping 58%, which does actually mean a lot because Hippowdon can't even go for the combination of Protect and Slack Off as a viable way around Garchomp. It would just outright have to slack off until you die or until it can get you in range of an Earthquake, because the Protect wouldn't actually make a difference. 2 Outrages would still completely finish you, so you can't even potentially try and get yourself out of range consistently like you could have if this was only an extra 1.5 boost. So it does make a difference. I wanted to point that out there because obviously, for example, even if we look at the max roll for this, it goes up from around like just over 60% to all the way, I want to say it's around like 69.6%. So it's about an 8% difference in the max roll range. Again, it makes a little bit of a difference for these calcs, but it's the important distinction to make because typically it was thought that you were only going to get one type of stab. And even if I go with this Terastal Outrage set, for example, I'm still getting a ground stab with this, which I'm just not having the weaknesses of it, which helps a lot defensively as well. So this is actually a huge difference. I think, in my opinion, this makes two type Pokemon that are changing into something else a lot more viable. And let's get into some of those. I tried to pick out 5 examples from singles and 5 examples from doubles, and there's definitely a lot of these that kind of overlap, so I'm sorry for how much these will overlap, but I tried to at least get some clear cuts in singles, clear cuts in doubles, and then some vague ones in between, because I felt like this would be the best way to showcase both ends and why I think both the Terastal Stab, the Terastal Non-Stab, as well as in singles and doubles will be really good for everything. So first up, let's start off with Dragapult. Now Dragapult, as I've mentioned in my Pokemon leaked Pokedex video, that I think this one will actually get banned from OU. This is a Pokemon that seemingly will be around even just in the regional decks of Paldea, which I think will be terrifying. For anything that I put the Terrablast typing for, Terrablast for, I put the Terrablast type that I think it will be, which in this case I think it's Ghost. Otherwise I put the text in gold, so then you could tell at least what type it was going to be terastalizing into. But in Dragapult's case, I think it'll terastalize in a Ghost. Now it could do Fairy, to be fair, not Fairy, Dragon, to be fair. There's not a lot of good fairies, and the Steel is really the best one, it's just Scizor. But I think the Terastal Ghost, at least on Dragonite sets, will be the best. Meanwhile, on spec sets or like Life Orb or Boots sets that are just specially oriented, I think it'll be Dragon or maybe even potentially Fire or Ground, but most likely Dragon. But Dragapult's an interesting one. I will say, I think that this will probably be the set that gets it banned, actually, because of the fact it will finally give a really good option for physical that's not a 2-turn move, which would otherwise have allowed in Pokemon such as Tyranitar to just hard swap on Dragapult on a Phantom Force turn, and then get off a hit afterwards on them. So I do think this actually does make a bit of a difference in how you would play around Dragapult, because it does take away the option of trying to pivot out on Dragapult into something that might actually check it as efficiently, and then revenge it off that way if it's Dragon Dance, and otherwise just chew the hit from specs. So I think this will be the set that pushes it over the edge, but in general, Dragon Dance Dragapult I think will be terrifying. Now, I will say you could also shift out Substitute. This could obviously be a mixed Dragapult very easily too. One of the really only good switch-ins I could think of to this set would be a Fizz Def Scizor, and you could just throw on Flamethrower. You don't really need Substitute, just it was typically ran in tandem with Phantom Force. I did still think it wasn't a terrible option though, but I will say with the best fairy defensively speaking being Sylveon, this probably isn't looking like a great 4th move on Dragapult, but I still think it has a place for sure. Next up though, we do have another singles Pokemon being Hydreigon, the thumbnail for this video obviously. I had to cover Hydreigon somewhere, and I think this is one of those clear-cut examples that really could actually genuinely take advantage of another typing, specifically in this case being Terastal Poison. Now in theory, Terastal Steel could work too, the goal is just a Fairy check, and with base 80 Terrablast from what it's seeming like according to people who got the game early, I don't actually think it matters, because typically if this was like a 60 base power move, you'd probably go for Steel and Hydreigon just to hit other fairies really hard like Sylveon, but Poison would probably be a bit better for the fairies that will probably be OU, considering we do have a Azumarill in the mix, and that's obviously neutral to Steel, and Terra Poison would probably be your best case to attack that with, since you would still hit Sylveon this way. So I'm personally thinking this will be a nasty plot Hydreigon. It might go with Life Orb over Leftovers. And I will say as well, I think this will probably only be an absolute monster in the Paldea Dex meta. I think that once we get into the home meta, where we're adding in Pokemon like Landorus and Amoris, etc., Hydreigon will probably just opt for more Scarf-based sets or maybe bulkier Roost sets. But as far as a 3-attack set, I think this will be the set it's running in at least the pre-home meta, because we're losing out on 2 really good bulky fairies to check this, or 1 really good bulky one and 1 that would naturally outpace, being an Amoris for both Therian and Incarnate. So I do think in the pre-home meta at least, this one will be a monster, but I think it'll have a place even still as a good Terastal user. Mostly just because of the fact that Nasty Plot plus this coverage set would be so good. You could obviously shift out stuff like Earth Power for Flamethrower, which would probably be better for Scizor, but also Earth Power is really good for Toxapex, which could obviously haze you, so it's a bit of give and take here. Next up though, we do have Garchomp. Now this will be Terastal Ground in my opinion. I did kind of weigh some options with Terastal Dragon, but ultimately I realized that there's actually pretty much no good ground switch-ins. And the ground switch-ins that exist are Breloom, Corviknight, and then other dragon flying types, or dragon levitators being Hydreigon. But the point being is that half of these Pokemon just get hit by Scale Shot anyway. So going for Terastal Ground I thought would be a lot better in this case. Now, to be fair, Terastal Dragon would still be monstrous. Even Terastal Fire would actually be pretty good to help with Corviknight matchup. But I don't think that they're really essential enough, and I think that ultimately Ground will just be the least drawback option, at least in the pre-Paldea Dex meta. To be fair, maybe if you get a really good Fist of Grass type, like for example, maybe let's say that the Sprigatito starter, for example, is a really good bulky grass. then maybe we'll see a shift to Dragon. But until then, I don't actually think that we're really going to see a non-ground set becoming at least the best set for Garchomp until the post-haul meta, when we're adding in stuff like Zapdos, for example, which will be an amazing switch into this set. Albeit it'll still have to worry about Terastal Dragon or Terastal Ground, both of which will be monstrous against it, but it's at least a decent option. Next up, though, we do have Weavile. Weavile will be a pretty decent Terastal Ice user. There's like no good Ice switch-ins, and all of the good Ice switch-ins get really pressured by a lot of other Pokemon that I think pair well with Weavile. For example, let's say Scizor's my Ice check. Well, I can use Scizor to set up with Volcarona, and Volcarona will go to town as another option that teams do need to consider as a potential Terastal bond, because Volcarona and Weavile as a core will actually destroy most teams in this meta. The one exception that's a mutual check to both would be Azumarill, and Weavile could actually still Terastal Poison around that pretty successfully. But I think that there's enough you could throw on to check just Azumarill. For example, Pokemon like Gengar, you could throw on stuff like Rotom Wash. Breloom is a decent check if it's not Sap Sipper, which it will not be Sap Sipper in this meta. With Breloom being the only OU capable grass, maybe Hisui Lilligant, I cannot see a meta where Azumarill is running Sap Sipper just for Breloom. It would be pretty wasteful. But I do think there's enough to where you could typically tailor a core with like Weavile, Rotom Wash, and Volcarona and handle pretty much every Pokemon in the metagame. I'm sure there'll be a couple exceptions around, but I think that core would handle pretty much anything I could think of off face value. But we'll have to see. I think it'll still be really good though, nonetheless. Finally, though, we do have our last mon in the singles side of things, being Victini. I think this will be an amazing Terastal Fire user in the post-haul meta. It could also go with Terastal Psychic, which would be a great way around Pex, which between Pex and Slowbro they would probably be two really good switch-ins to a Terastal Fire set. You could also go with Terastal Electric in that regard, though, and just getting a third stab, which would be really good in my opinion. Though I think this would typically only be ran on some sort of Flame Charge variation, because I can't really actually see a Choice Victini ever running a non-Terastal Fire moveset. And on top of it as well, I also can't see any sort of just pivoting Victini like this running a non-Terastal Fire set. Whereas in this case, I could actually see it, because typically your goal would just be trying to bait in the water types by clicking Terastal Fire, then just going for Bolt Strike and taking the hits pretty well. Albeit, well, to be fair, maybe that's reason for Terastal Electric. I don't know. I think Victini has a lot of options though, regardless, and Terastal Fire will be obnoxious to switch around, especially if you're throwing this on a Banded Victini. You're probably gonna 2 KO if not OHKO everything in the meta. Next up, though, we do get into our singles and our doubles Pokemon, starting with our double singles Pokemon being Landorus T. Now, this I think will probably go with Terastal Flying, whether OU or in VGC, though I think especially in VGC, it will be a lot more leaning towards Terastal Flying, because it gives Landorus an actual flying stab that's viable outside of just Fly, which isn't really that great. And I think especially considering the fact that a lot of the common Pokemon that will most likely be ran, for example, I think it's just a lot of the fact that while there's a lot of good Pokemon that in general are weak to ground, I think that there's just also even more Pokemon that just have no switch into flying. Considering the best switch-ins to flying would be like the Rotom forms or I guess Magnezone. None of them really want to actually risk Landorus depending on the moveset it's going for, because Terastal Rock would still do a ton of damage. Even to Rotom Wash, it would do a ton of damage, considering you could throw that onto Stone Edge and now getting Stab Stone Edge for Rotom. So I do think that Landorus will be an absolute menace in this meta. There's a lot of Terastal types that work on it. You could also potentially utilize something like a Terastal Fire, though I will say that would really just be for Corviknight, and it would really only be for singles. Even still, just go for Smackdown at that point. You could throw it on over Stone Edge if you want, and just go Terastal Ground. It'll be a lot better, but I do think the Terastal Flying will probably be the moveset of choice here, because I think that in tandem, Landorus could in theory run a moveset that would handle everything else. If you're running this in VGC as well, you could throw on Stone Edge, Rock Slide, or Smackdown. Any of those work. It just sort of depends on what you really feel comfortable with. But next up, though, we do have Salamence. Now, Salamence, as I mentioned in my data mine leaks for VGC, I think this will be a really good rain option as an Intimidate mon. So I think the Terastal Flying with the Hurricane will be on here. I thought I changed the item to Heavy Duty Boots in the slide, well, from Heavy Duty Boots, but it was actually supposed to be a Citrus Berry. Though if you're running this in singles, this set also would work really well in singles, in my opinion. You could potentially also just make it Dragon Dance with Roost, Dragon Dance, Earthquake, and then Terra Flying for the physical side. There's a lot of options you have with Salamence, so I'm sorry for the typo, though. This is meant to be a Citrus Berry. You could also, though, ditch Flamethrower for Hydro Pump since you're on Rain, and go for an Assault Vest, and that would still actually be pretty good, considering that would be an amazing sponge to Torkoal, for example, and you could go for Hydro Pump and nuke it. So you do have a lot of options there, albeit I think that Roost 3 attacks, or even Protect 3 attacks, will be the best case scenario with a Citrus Berry for VGC. Next up, we have Tyranitar. Tyranitar, I think, will be an amazing weakness policy one, especially considering the fact that there are not really a lot of top-tier fighting types, in my opinion. And on top of that as well, Dragon Dance T-Tar, I think, will be an amazing option of Terra Dark. For a lot of other Pokemon, I think will be decent, especially Psy Spam. This will be an amazing Psy Spam check. And I think the one thing I'll be curious about, though, is if it'll keep its interaction with Sand. If it doesn't keep its interaction with Sand still, because it will technically be losing the Rock typing in its weakness calculation, then I think that Terastal Rock also has a competition for here. But I think that Dark ultimately, specifically as a really good check to Psy Spam teams while still giving Weather if there's a really good Sand Rush mon, will probably be the best case scenario for T-Tar, in my opinion. This could also be a nerf just as easily to get around berries, but I think there's a case for Sand, even if it's just to clear Weather from Torkoal, because Torkoal, I think, will be just that good of a Pokemon, but we'll have to see. As far as Torkoal, speaking of, Terastal Fire, pretty low drawback set. This will honestly be an incredible menace for Trick Room, and I think even with whether Terastal works how we're calculating it for or not, even if for some reason it's weaker than we're accounting for right now, I still think this will be one of, if not the best Trick Room Terastal Pokemon, no doubt about it. Torkoal will be a fucking menace, going for Terastal Fire on every Pokemon in Gastrodon and Solar Beam on Gastrodon. Eruption already is obnoxious to switch around and now doing even more damage on top of that. This is going to be an objective top 5 Pokemon, in my opinion. You will need a check to this in like every team, and if I had to guess, Trick Room would have to get seriously nerfed for this not to be a top 5 Pokemon, or Torkoal. But finally, though, we do have our Intimidate counter being Galar Zapdos. Now, Galar Zapdos will probably be around specifically in the post-home metagame, but I do think it'll be amazing as an Intimidate turn. Specifically with Defiant plus Brave Bird, you'll be able to go for Terastal Flying sets. And again, similarly to why I thought the stuff like Landorus would run Terastal Flying, there's not really a lot of good flying checks in VGC that I noticed. I will say, though, in this case, to be fair, they're a little bit better against Zapdos specifically, but close combat will still do a ton of damage, and you can always go with Terastal Fighting and do really good against a lot of other Pokemon. I just think that Terastal Flying will be lower drawback against a lot of the top tiers. But regardless, though, let me know what you guys think. Do you think that Terastal will be broken? And what are your thoughts on it now that we have this updated information? If you guys enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, leave a like below and subscribe. Shoutouts to our channel members, though, being Josh, aka Ultra Player, Zeke Zero, and Mia. Your guys' support on the channel is very much appreciated. And if you want to become a channel member today before Scarlet and Violet, link to that is down below, as well as to our Twitter and Discord, where you can stay up to date on future videos. With that said, I will see you guys in tomorrow's video. Until then, peace out, guys.